The little boy had not spoken a single word in 6 years. Yet in the middle of a crowded pediatric rehabilitation center, surrounded by the country's most celebrated specialists, multi-million-dollar technology, and a desperate CEO who had just promised $750,000 to anyone who could calm his terrified son, everything changed in a single heartbeat. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a therapist. It wasn't a genius scientist. It was the quiet janitor pushing a faded cleaning cart down the hallway, and the one gentle word he whispered made the entire room freeze. Graham Whitmore had spent most of his life believing every problem had a price. He had built one of the largest technology companies in North America through relentless discipline, impossible standards, and decisions that often valued results over relationships. Magazine covers called him brilliant. Business leaders called him fearless. His employees called him demanding. Boardrooms grew quiet when he walked in, and rivals learned early that he rarely lost a negotiation because he simply refused to accept an outcome he hadn't already decided on. But none of those titles meant anything every afternoon when he looked into the frightened blue eyes of his 10-year-old son, Rowan, who had not spoken since the terrible accident that had taken his mother 6 years earlier. Doctors called Rowan nonverbal. Specialists described his silence with complicated medical terms, filling pages of reports with clinical language that never seemed to capture what Graham saw at home each night. Graham only saw a little boy trapped behind invisible walls, a boy who still laughed silently at cartoons, who still reached for his father's hand in the dark, who still understood every word spoken to him even though none came back out. That contradiction, a mind so clearly present, a voice so completely gone, had haunted Graham for 6 years, through every specialist, every clinic, every promising treatment that ultimately changed nothing. The rehabilitation center had become almost a second home. Every weekday morning Graham arrived before sunrise meetings, carrying quiet hope that this appointment might finally be different. He had rearranged his entire company around Rowan's schedule, delegating what he once refused to delegate, missing meetings he once considered unmissable. His assistants had learned not to schedule anything before 10 in the morning on weekdays. His board had learned not to ask why. Rowan never screamed without reason, but crowded rooms, unfamiliar faces, and sudden noises overwhelmed him. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the enormous windows, painting warm patterns across the polished floor, yet Rowan was trembling uncontrollably. Every attempt by the therapists to comfort him only seemed to deepen his panic. A new specialist had been brought in that day, flown in from another city at considerable expense, along with a portable sensory unit that was supposed to help children like Rowan regulate their nervous systems. None of it worked. If anything, the unfamiliar machine, with its soft blinking lights and quiet hum, seemed to make Rowan more afraid, not less. As nurses gently backed away and specialists exchanged worried glances, Graham's carefully controlled composure shattered. He stood in the center of the room and made a promise born entirely from desperation. His voice echoed through the hallway as he announced he would personally pay $750,000 to anyone who could help his son feel safe again. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one believed healing could be purchased, yet everyone understood the pain behind the impossible offer. A nurse near the doorway later admitted she had never seen a grown man's voice crack the way Graham's had in that moment. A voice built for boardrooms suddenly sounding like nothing more than a frightened father. Dozens of experts tried. Some spoke softly, kneeling at Rowan's eye level with practiced, gentle voices. Others introduced sensory toys, calming music, breathing exercises, and familiar picture cards, each method backed by years of training and research. One therapist tried a weighted blanket. Another dimmed the lights and played recordings of ocean waves. Rowan only curled tighter into himself, covering his ears while tears rolled silently down his cheeks. Graham dropped to his knees beside him, feeling utterly powerless for the first time in his life. His fortune, influence, and reputation had never seemed so meaningless. He would have given away every dollar he owned in that moment simply to hear his son say one word, even his name. Down the hallway, Everett Hale quietly continued mopping the floor. Most people barely noticed Everett. At 68 years old, his gray hair, worn work shoes, and faded maintenance uniform made him almost invisible in a building full of white coats and expensive equipment. Staff members appreciated his reliability, but knew little about his life. He smiled at everyone, remembered birthdays, fixed broken chairs without being asked, and somehow always knew which patients needed an encouraging nod and which ones needed to be left alone entirely. He arrived before most of the staff and left after most of them had gone home, humming quietly to himself as he worked. Few realized that years earlier he had been a respected elementary school music teacher, the kind who kept a classroom full of restless 8-year-olds calm simply by the tone of his voice. He had taught for 31 years before losing his wife, Marion, to a long illness that slowly took first her strength and then her memory. Retirement had left him lonely in a house that suddenly felt far too large and far too quiet. Working as a janitor gave him purpose, because, as he often believed, every building needed someone who cared for both its floors and the hearts walking across them. He had turned down 2 offers to return to teaching, saying only that he preferred a job where nobody expected anything from him except showing up. When Everett heard Rowan's frightened cries, he didn't rush toward the commotion. Instead, he quietly parked his cleaning cart against the wall and watched from a respectful distance. He noticed details others overlooked. Rowan wasn't afraid of people. He was afraid of being surrounded. Every new voice became another wave crashing against him. Every attempt to comfort him unintentionally demanded something in return: eye contact, a response, a sign of progress that could be written down on a chart. Everett recognized something in the boy's posture that reminded him of children he had taught decades earlier. Children who needed the room to stop asking things of them before they could even begin to breathe normally again. Everett slowly removed his work gloves and sat several feet away on the warm floor without saying anything. He didn't reach toward the child. He didn't make promises. He simply became still. The therapists looked confused, glancing at one another as if waiting for someone to intervene. Graham wanted to interrupt, but somehow couldn't. There was something peaceful about the old janitor's patience that made everyone else instinctively step back, as though the room itself had decided to give this stranger room to try. Nearly a full minute passed in complete silence. Then Everett gently whispered a single word. Safe. Nothing more. Just one quiet word spoken without expectation. Rowan's breathing slowed. Everett didn't repeat himself right away. He simply remained seated, allowing silence to do what endless conversation never had. A few seconds later, Rowan slowly lifted his head. For the first time that afternoon, his breathing became steady. His shoulders relaxed. His hands uncovered his ears. Nobody dared move, not the specialist with the sensory unit, not the nurses by the door, not even Graham, who knelt frozen beside his son, afraid that a single sound might break whatever fragile thing was happening. Everett smiled with the warmth of a grandfather who understood that trust could never be rushed. He softly repeated the same word. Safe. Tears filled Graham's eyes before he even realized he was crying. The room remained perfectly still as Rowan cautiously crawled a little closer to the old man on the floor. He didn't speak, but he no longer looked trapped. He looked curious, tilting his head slightly, studying Everett's face the way a child studies something unfamiliar but no longer frightening. Afterward, once Rowan had calmed enough to sit quietly against his father's side, Everett quietly explained that frightened children often needed less instruction and more reassurance. Sometimes the greatest comfort wasn't solving the fear, but convincing the child they no longer faced it alone. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had once had a student who reacted the same way to fire drills, and that shouting instructions at a frightened child rarely helped, no matter how kind the intention behind them. The therapists listened carefully, surprised by the simplicity of what they had forgotten beneath years of professional training and clinical procedure. Over the following weeks, Graham requested that Everett spend time with Rowan during therapy sessions. The janitor refused any special treatment or recognition. He insisted he wasn't performing miracles. He was simply offering presence instead of pressure. When the center's director offered to adjust his schedule and give him an official title, Everett declined that too, saying he preferred to keep pushing his cart down the same hallways he always had. He asked only that he be allowed 15 minutes with Rowan most mornings, nothing more. Every morning, sunlight filled the therapy room as Everett arrived with small objects collected from nature during his walks through the local park: smooth stones, feathers, tiny pine cones, leaves shaped like stars. He kept them in an old cigar box that had once belonged to his father. Rowan silently arranged them into careful patterns on the floor while Everett hummed gentle melodies from old classroom songs, the same ones he used to sing to calm restless children decades earlier. There were no demands for conversation, no rewards for progress, only quiet companionship. Some mornings they simply sat together and watched dust drift through the sunlight, without saying anything at all, and Everett never once seemed impatient for that to change. Slowly, impossible things began happening. Rowan started making eye contact more often, first with Everett, then hesitantly with his father, then eventually with the therapists he had once flinched from. He smiled. He laughed silently, shoulders shaking with a joy that made no sound. He reached for Everett's hand during their morning walks around the garden. Each tiny step felt larger than any business victory Graham had ever celebrated, larger than any acquisition or headline or record quarter. Graham began keeping a small notebook, the kind he once used for meeting notes, except now it only contained short lines. Tuesday, he smiled at the nurse. Thursday, he held my hand without me reaching first. One afternoon, while sitting beside a garden filled with colorful flowers outside the rehabilitation center, Rowan pointed toward a butterfly resting on a bright yellow blossom. Everett smiled but said nothing, following the boy's gaze toward the fluttering wings. After several long seconds, Rowan whispered his first word in 6 years. Beautiful. The sound barely rose above the breeze. Graham heard it anyway. He collapsed onto the nearby bench, overcome with emotion, covering his face as years of guilt, grief, and hopelessness poured out in tears he had been holding back since the accident. Every doctor nearby stopped what they were doing. Several nurses cried openly, some of them women who had worked with Rowan for years without ever hearing his voice. The miracle wasn't simply that Rowan had spoken. It was that he had chosen beauty as his first word. After everything, after so much silence and fear, the first thing he offered the world again was something gentle. That evening, Graham offered Everett the promised $750,000. Everett quietly declined. He explained that healing was never something to sell, that no number could account for what had happened between an old man and a frightened child on a hospital floor. He had spent decades teaching children before life unexpectedly led him to a janitor's cart, and he said plainly that titles had changed, but caring hadn't. He asked Graham instead to use the money for families who couldn't afford therapy for their own children, families who didn't have a company or a fortune behind them, only worry and love and very little else. For the first time in many years, Graham accepted advice instead of giving it. Within months, the Whitmore Foundation opened a program providing free therapy, counseling, transportation, and educational support for children with communication challenges, regardless of their family's income. Graham personally reviewed every application himself for the first year, something his staff found strange for a man who once refused to read his own emails. Everett agreed to become its community mentor, though he insisted on keeping his janitor uniform, because he never wanted people to believe kindness required an important title or a framed certificate on the wall. Parents who entered the center no longer saw only expensive equipment and busy specialists. They saw volunteers sitting patiently beside frightened children, some of them trained by Everett himself in nothing more complicated than sitting still and waiting. Doctors collaborated more closely with families instead of speaking over their heads. Therapists learned, somewhat humbly, that silence sometimes carried more healing than endless instructions, and several of them began building quiet time into their sessions where none had existed before. Rowan continued, improving one gentle step at a time. His vocabulary grew slowly, word by word, each one recorded in Graham's notebook like a small treasure. But his confidence grew even faster than his vocabulary did. He discovered a love for drawing birds, trees, and butterflies, filling sketchbooks with colorful reminders that hope often arrives quietly, without announcement, without anyone expecting it. He began attending a small group session with other children, and though he still spoke rarely, he no longer trembled at the sound of other voices in the room. Graham transformed as well. Boardroom victories no longer defined him the way they once had. He attended school events he would have delegated to an assistant a year earlier. He took afternoon walks with Rowan through the same park where Everett collected his stones and feathers, learning to notice the same small things his son noticed. He learned to celebrate small moments instead of chasing endless achievements, and he realized later than he would have liked, that being present was worth far more than being powerful. Everett never became famous. A local paper ran a short story about the janitor and the CEO's son, and for a week or two people in town recognized him at the grocery store and thanked him for something he still insisted wasn't remarkable. Then the story faded, as stories do, and newspapers moved on to newer headlines. He didn't mind. Every morning he still greeted people with the same humble smile, pushed the same cleaning cart through bright hallways, and reminded frightened children they were safe simply by showing up with calm patience and genuine compassion. He still hummed the same old classroom songs. He still kept his cigar box of stones and feathers in his cart, replenished from his morning walks. Years later, visitors entering the rehabilitation center often noticed a small framed message near the reception desk, easy to miss unless you happened to be looking down while waiting for an appointment. It didn't mention money, success, or remarkable achievements. It simply read that the greatest healing begins when someone chooses to make another person feel safe. Families paused to read those words before beginning their own difficult journeys, and many found themselves smiling through tears because they suddenly believed tomorrow could be brighter than today, even if today still felt impossibly hard. Rowan, older now, sometimes stopped by the center on weekends to visit Everett, who had finally, reluctantly, agreed to work only part-time. They still sat together in the garden sometimes, not saying much, watching butterflies drift between the flowers the way they had years earlier. Some things, it turned out, didn't need to change to remain exactly as meaningful as they had always been.